Chapter 6. The Festivities. When Inigo regained consciousness, it was still night on the cliffs of insanity. Far below, the waters of Florin Channel pounded. Inigo stirred, blinked, tried to rub his eyes. Couldn't. His arms were tied together around a tree. Inigo blinked again, banishing cobwebs. He had gone on his knees to the man in black, ready for death. Clearly, the victor had other notions. Inigo looked around as best he could, and there it was, the six-fingered sword glittering in the moonlight like lost magic. Inigo stretched his right hand as far as it would go and managed to touch the handle. Then it was simply a matter of inching the weapon close enough to be graspable by one hand, and then it was an even simpler task to slash his bindings. He was dizzy when he stood, and he rubbed his head behind his ear where the man in black had struck him. A lump, sizable to be sure, but not a major problem. The major problem was what to do now. Vizzini had strict instructions for occasions such as this when a plan went wrong. Go back to the beginning. Back to the beginning and wait for Vizzini. Then regroup, replan, start again. Inigo had even made a little rhyme out of it for Fezzik so the giant would not have problems remembering what to do in times of trouble. Fool, fool, back to the beginning is the rule. Inigo knew precisely where the beginning was. They had gotten the job in Florin City itself, the thieves' quarter. Vizzini had made the arrangements alone, as he always did. He had met with their employer, had accepted the job, had planned it, all in the thieves' quarter. So the thieves' quarter was clearly the place to go. Only Inigo hated it. Everybody was so dangerous, big, mean, and muscular. And so what if he was the greatest fencer in the world? Who'd know it to look at him? He looked like a skinny Spanish guy it might be fun to rob. You couldn't walk around with a sign saying, "Be careful, this is the greatest fencer since the death of the Wizard of Corsica. Do not burgle." Besides, and here Inigo felt deep pain, he wasn't that great a fencer. Not anymore. He couldn't be. Hadn't he just been beaten? Once, true, he had been a titan, but now. The thieves' quarter was worse than he remembered. Always before, Fezzik had been with him, and they had made rhymes, and Fezzik was enough to keep any thief away. Inigo moved, panicked, up the dark streets, desperately afraid. Why this giant fear? What was he afraid of? He sat on a filthy stoop and pondered. Around him there were cries in the night, and from the alehouses, vulgar laughter. He was afraid, he realized then, because as he sat there gripping the six-fingered sword for confidence, he was suddenly back to what he had been before Vizzini had found him. A failure. A man without a point, with no attachment to tomorrow. Inigo had not touched brandy in years. Now he felt his fingers fumbling for money. Now he heard his footsteps running toward the nearest alehouse. Now he saw his money on the counter. Now he felt the brandy bottle in his hands. Back to the stoop he ran. He opened the bottle. He smelled the rough brandy. He took a sip. He coughed. He took a swallow. He coughed again. He gulped it down and coughed and gulped some more and half began a smile. His fears were starting to leave him. After all, why should he have even ever been afraid? He was Inigo Montoya, the bottle was half gone now, son of the great Domingo Montoya. So what was there in the world worth fearing? Now all the brandy was gone. How dare fear approach a wizard such as Inigo Montoya? Well, never again. Into the second bottle. Never, 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 never again. He sat alone and confident and strong. His life was straight and fine. He had money enough for brandy, and if you had that, you had the world. The stoop was wretched and bleak. Inigo slumped there, quite contented, clutching the bottle in his once trembling hands. Existence was really very simple when you did what you were told, and nothing could be simpler or better than what he had in store. All he had to do was wait and drink until Vizzini came. Fezzik had no idea how long he was unconscious. He only knew as he staggered to his feet on the mountain path that his throat was very sore where the man in black had strangled him. What to do? The plans had all gone wrong. Fezzik closed his eyes, trying to think. There was a proper place to go when plans went wrong, but he couldn't quite remember it. Inigo had even made up a rhyme for him so he wouldn't forget, and now, even with that, he was so stupid he had forgotten. Was that it? Was it stupid, stupid, go and wait for Vizzini with Cupid? That rhymed, but where was the Cupid? Dummy, dummy, go out now and fill your tummy? That rhymed too, but what kind of instructions were those? What to do? What to do? Dunce, dunce, use your brains and do it right for once? No help. Nothing was any help. He never had done anything right, not in his whole life, until Vizzini came, and without another thought, Fezzik ran off into the night after the Sicilian. Vizzini was napping when he got there. He had been drinking wine and had dozed off. Fezzik dropped to his knees and put his hands in a prayer position. "Vizzini, I'm sorry," he began. Vizzini napped on. Fezzik shook him gently. Vizzini did not wake. Not so gently this time. Nothing. "Oh, I see. You're dead," Fezzik said. He stood up. "He's dead, Vizzini is," he said softly, and then, with not a bit of help from his brain, a great scream of panic burst from his throat into the night. "Inigo!" He whirled back down the mountain path, because if Inigo was alive, it would be all right. It wouldn't be the same. No, it could never be that without Vizzini to order them and insult them as only he could, but at least there would be time for poetry. And when Fezzik reached the cliffs of insanity, he said, "Inigo! Inigo, here I am!" to the rocks, and "I'm here, Inigo, it's your Fezzik!" to the trees, and "Inigo! Inigo, answer me, please!" all over, until there was no other conclusion to draw but that just as there was now no Vizzini, so was there also no Inigo, and that was hard. It was, in point of fact, too hard for Fezzik. So he began to run, crying out, "Be with you in a minute, Inigo," and "Right behind you, Inigo," and "Hey, Inigo, wait up!" Wait up, straight up, which was the way he ran, and wouldn't there be fun with rhymes once he and Inigo were together again. But after an hour or so of shouting, his throat gave out because he had, after all, been strangled almost to death in the very recent past. On he ran, on and on and on, until he finally reached a tiny village and found, just outside the town, some nice rocks that formed a kind of cave almost big enough for him to stretch out in. He sat with his back against a rock and his hands around his knees and his throat hurting until the village boys found him. They held their breath and crept as close as they dared. Fezzik hoped they would go away, so he froze, pretending to be off with Inigo, and Inigo would say "Beryl," and Fezzik would right quick come back with "Carol," and maybe they would sing a little something until Inigo said "Serenade," and you couldn't stump Fezzik with that one because it was easy. He said "Centigrade," and then Inigo would make a word about the weather, and Fezzik would rhyme it, and that was how it went until the village boys stopped being afraid of him. Fezzik could tell that because they were creeping very close to him now, and all of a sudden yelling their lungs out and making crazy faces. He didn't really blame them. He looked like the kind of person you did that to. Mocked. His clothes were torn, and his throat was gone, and his eyes were wild, and he probably would have yelled too if he'd been their age. It was only when they found him funny that he found it, though he did not know the word, degrading. No more yelling, just laughter now. Laughter, Fezzik thought. And then he thought, giraffer, because that's all he was to them, some huge, funny thing that couldn't make much noise. Laughter, giraffer, from now to hereafter. Fezzik huddled up in his cave and tried looking on the bright side. At least they weren't throwing things at him. Not yet, anyway. Wesley awoke chained in a giant cage. His shoulder was beginning to fester from the gnawing and digging that the ROUS had done into his flesh. He ignored the discomfort momentarily to try to adjust to his surroundings. He was certainly underground. It was not the lack of windows that made that sure, more the dankness. From somewhere above him now he could hear animal noises, an occasional lion roar, the yelp of a cheetah. Shortly after his return to consciousness, the albino appeared, bloodless, with skin as pale as dying birch. The candlelight that served to illuminate the cage made the albino seem totally like a creature who had never seen the sun. The albino held a tray which carried many things, bandages and food, healing powders and brandy. "Where are we?" from Wesley. A shrug from the albino. "Who are you?" Shrug. That was almost the entire extent of the fellow's conversation. Wesley asked question after question while the albino tended and redressed his wound, then fed him food that was warm and surprisingly good and plentiful. Shrug, shrug. "Who knows I'm here?" Shrug. "Lie, but tell me something. Give an answer. Who knows I'm here?" Whispered. "I know. They know." "They?" Shrug. "The prince and count, you mean?" Nod. "And that is all?" Nod. "When I was brought in, I was half conscious. The count was giving the orders, but 3 soldiers were carrying me. They know too." Shake. Whispered. "No." "They're dead, is that what you're saying?" Shrug. "Am I to die then?" Shrug. Wesley lay back on the floor of the giant underground cage, watching as the albino silently reloaded the tray, glided from sight. If the soldiers were dead, surely it was not unreasonable to assume that he would eventually follow. But if they wanted his erasure, surely it was also not unreasonable to assume that they had not the least intention of doing it immediately. Else why tend his wounds? Why return his strength with good warm food? No, his death would be a while yet. But in the meantime, considering the personalities of his captors, it was finally not unreasonable to assume that they would do their best to make him suffer greatly. Wesley closed his eyes. There was pain coming, and he had to be ready for it. He had to prepare his brain, had to get his mind controlled and safe from their efforts, so that they could not break him. He would not let them break him. He would hold together against anything and all. If only they gave him sufficient time to make ready, he knew he could defeat pain. It turned out they gave him sufficient time. It was months before the machine was ready. But they broke him anyway.